The coin jar never filled. That was the first true fact of Della Crane's life. The one that sat at the center of everything else, the way a stone sits at the center of a frozen pond. You could walk around it. You could look away from it. But it was always there, and the ice around it was always thinner than everywhere else. And Della had learned before she was old enough to properly reckon years that the difference between surviving and not surviving was mostly a matter of knowing exactly where to put your feet. She was 19 years old in the February of 1884, and she had been managing that particular kind of careful walking for most of her conscious life. Silver Creek, Montana in winter was not a beautiful place, though some people who had never spent a winter there might have called it one from a distance. The mountains held their snow in a way that looked deliberate, almost proud, and the sky on clear days went a shade of blue so deep and cold it seemed less like weather and more like a declaration. But beauty observed from a distance and cold endured up close are two entirely different experiences, and Della had only ever known the second kind. She woke each morning in a room above Bodine's commercial laundry on Garnet Street. A room so small that standing in the center of it she could touch both side walls with her elbows bent. The ceiling sloped with the pitch of the roof, and the single window faced north, which meant it collected no warmth and offered nothing in the way of morning light. Only a pale gray suggestion of daylight that arrived sometime after 6, and did not improve much by noon. The floorboards were soft in 2 places near the door, and she had learned to step around them without thinking, the way you learn to avoid a creak on the stairs of a house you have lived in long enough. There was a nail beside the door for her coat. There was a washstand she shared with the 2 other women who rented rooms on the same floor, a narrow deal table under the window, a chair with a cracked spindle in the cot. That was the sum of it. That was the room. And on the table by the washstand, always the jar. It was a canning jar, the wide-mouthed kind, the glass gone slightly cloudy with age, and one side of the rim chipped in a half-moon that Della had wrapped in a strip of muslin so it would not cut her fingers when she counted. She counted often. The coins inside were mostly pennies, and the occasional nickel accumulated in the patient grinding way that money accumulates when you work 6 days a week for wages that are never quite what was agreed and always less than what is needed. She had been adding to that jar for 4 years, since the day she arrived in Silver Creek at 15, with a carpet bag and no one waiting for her. In 4 years of adding, the jar had never once been full. This was not self-pity. Della was not a woman given to self-pity, partly because she had never been given the time for it, and partly because she had understood from a very young age that feeling sorry for yourself was a luxury that cost exactly as much energy as it gave back, which was to say nothing. It was an accounting that made no sense, and Della was very good at accounting. She understood numbers the way some people understand music, not formally, not because anyone had taught her theory, but in the way that certain minds simply hear pitch accurately without instruction. She could look at a column of figures and know before she added them whether they would fall short or clear. She could estimate weights and measures by hand and eye within margins that made Mrs. Bodine, her employer, occasionally narrow her gaze with something between suspicion and reluctant respect. This facility with numbers was one of the two things Della had in the world that she considered genuine advantages. The other was the memory of her grandfather's hands. Gideon Crane had been a stonemason by inclination and a farmer by necessity, though neither description captured the man with any particular accuracy. He was better described as a person who looked at broken or complicated things with a kind of patient curiosity, as though the problem itself were interesting, as though the difficulty were not an obstacle but an invitation to think carefully. Della had understood this about him even as a child, when she had visited the farm at Black Fir Valley twice in the summer she was 8 years old, the last good summer before her mother got sick, and the world reorganized itself around that fact. She remembered the farm, the way you remember a place you visited when you were very young, and briefly very happy in fragments that carry more feeling than image. The smell of pine resin coming down off the valley wall in the evening, the sound the creek made along the northern edge of the property, a sound like someone turning pages in another room. The particular quality of light in the valley in late afternoon, golden and slightly horizontal, the kind of light that made everything it touched look more solid and more real than ordinary light did. And she remembered Gideon's hands. He had the hands of a man who had spent most of his life doing work that required precision rather than just strength. The palms were wide and the knuckles pronounced, but the fingers were careful, deliberate in their movement, almost slow. He never reached for anything the way most people reach for things impatiently, inaccurately. He moved toward things with intention, as though he had already decided exactly how he would pick them up before his hand was halfway there. He had crouched beside her on the bank of the creek that first summer, and shown her how to tell which direction water moved underground by the angle of moss on the stones along the bank. Not all moss showed it, he said. You had to look at the kind that grew in the seam between the rock face and the bank soil, the dark gray-green kind almost black in shadow. The moss grew thicker on the downhill side where water seeped, and if you knew which direction the seep ran, you could follow it back to where the water was strongest. She had been 8 years old, and she had listened with the complete attention that children give when they understand somehow that they are being given something that matters. He had not said, "This will be useful someday." He had not said, "Remember this." He had simply shown her the way you show someone a path through a wood, because knowing the path is better than not knowing it, and because knowledge given freely costs the giver nothing, and gives the receiver something they carry without weight. On the second visit, he had shown her how to read soil. He took a handful from the lower field near the creek and pressed it between his palms, and then opened his hands and looked at the color it left on his skin. Dark, he said, almost brown-black. That color meant moisture retention, meant the soil was holding what it was given, rather than letting it run through. He pressed her palm into the soil and made her feel the density of it, the way it held together without crumbling, the difference between that and the pale, sandy soil up near the road, where nothing much grew. She had pressed her small hand into the cold earth and felt it close slightly around her fingers. And Gideon had watched her face and said nothing because nothing needed saying. She understood what she was being shown. The understanding lived in her hands as much as in her mind. He had taught her to hammer a nail correctly, too. not just driving it, but setting it. Understanding the difference between a nail-driven straight that would hold and a nail-driven slightly off angle that would work loose under load. He showed her how a well-placed nail in the right grain of wood could carry weight that surprised you, and how a nail driven wrong into the same board would pull free in a season. He was not a talkative man. His letters to her, which came every few weeks in the years after she had left for Silver Creek, were brief and precise, the handwriting cramped and careful, each word earning its place on the page, the way each stone earned its place in a wall. They always ended the same way. Keep your eyes open, Della girl. The world hides more than it shows. She had smiled at that when she was younger. Lately, before he died, it had begun to feel like something other than comfort. It had begun to feel like instruction. He died on the 4th of January, quietly in his sleep. The way people sometimes say good men are allowed to go, as though dying is a transaction with terms that can be negotiated by the quality of your character. A neighbor found him and sent word to Silver Creek by post. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning when Della was already at work feeding sheets through the wringer, and Mrs. Bodine handed it over without comment, which was about as much ceremony as the woman offered for anything that was not directly related to the movement of linens. Della read it twice, standing at the back of the laundry where the air smelled of lye soap and hot iron. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket and went back to work, because there was nothing else to do. She had borrowed a black ribbon from the woman in the room next to hers and worn it in her hair for a week, which was the fullest expression of grief available to a person with 6 working days and a coin jar that did not fill. She had not known then that he had left her anything. The formal letter came 3 weeks after the funeral, delivered not by the regular post, but by a boy from the county land office in Deaver who looked embarrassed to be handing it over, which Della found odd, and which she would not fully understand until she had read the contents twice. The letter was from the county clerk, and it informed her in the particular dry and official language of county clerks that one Gideon Ruford Crane had recorded her name as sole heir to the property at Black Fir Valley. 40 acres, a barn, a stone well, and a collapsed outbuilding assessed at minimal value. Minimal value. The phrase sat on the page with the calm indifference of a fact that has never been asked to justify itself. Tucked inside the official envelope between the deed summary and the legal notice was a second envelope smaller. The paper slightly yellowed as though it had been kept somewhere dry for a long time. Her name was on the front in her grandfather's cramped, careful hand, and she recognized it immediately, the way you recognize a voice you have not heard in years the moment it begins to speak. She did not open it immediately. She slid it into her coat pocket alongside the official documents and finished her shift because she had 3 more hours remaining, and the habit of finishing what she had started was one she had never found a reason to break. She fed sheets through the wringer. She folded. She stacked. She moved through the familiar geography of the laundry with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done a thing so many times that the body handles it without much consultation with the mind. And she thought about what 40 acres in Black Fir Valley actually meant. She had not been back since she was 8. She knew the valley by reputation now. which is to say she knew what people in Silver Creek said about it when it came up, which was not often because the valley was the kind of subject that produced the particular conversational brevity of something everyone has already formed an opinion about and no longer finds interesting to discuss. The land was hard. The soil was poor in the upper fields. The winters came early and stayed late in that particular hollow between the ridges. Gideon Crane had farmed it in his stubborn, solitary way for decades, and the farm had never amounted to much. And now that he was gone, there was nothing left of it worth the trip. Mrs. Bodine offered her opinion without being asked, which was the only way Mrs. Bodine offered opinions the next morning when Della mentioned the letter. She was a solid, efficient woman of 50-something who ran the laundry with the particular joyless competence of someone who had decided long ago that sentiment was a structural weakness and had built her entire professional character around its absence. She did not look up from her ledger. That valley land, she said, is good for nothing. Hard winter, bad soil, no neighbors worth mentioning. Your grandfather was a decent old man, but he was no farmer. And everyone in this town knew it. You would be a fool to chase after a ruin. Della said nothing. She began the first sheet of the morning. The official envelope went back into her coat pocket, and she touched it 11 times over the course of the day. Not counting, not planning, just aware of it the way you are aware of a splinter in your palm. Not painful exactly, but present, requiring a small, constant part of your attention. That evening, alone in the small room above the laundry, she sat on the edge of the cot, with the coin jar on the table beside her, and the lamp turned up as high as the oil would sustain, and she opened the smaller envelope. The letter inside was 2 pages written small, the ink a little faded, as though it had indeed been written some time ago and stored carefully against the day it would be needed. The date at the top was January 1882, 2 full years before Gideon died, which meant he had written it while he was still able to be deliberate about things, while he still had time to choose his words the way he chose everything without hurry and without waste. Della girl, it began. She read the first paragraph standing up, then sat down on the cot and read the rest without moving. Don't let them tell you what something is worth before you've looked at it yourself. That is the first and most important thing. People have been telling you what things are worth your whole life, and they have mostly been wrong about the things that mattered. Come to the farm. Look at the well first. Look carefully. Not at what it appears to be, at what it actually is. There is something there for you. I built it for you over a long time, and I am sorry it took so long, and I am sorry I could not give it to you sooner, or in a simpler way. But the time it took is part of what it is, and what it is, I believe, is enough. Keep your eyes open, Della girl. The world hides more than it shows. Love, your grandfather Gideon. She read it 4 times. Then she set it down on the cot beside her and looked at the wall for a while. Look at the well first. Not look at the land. Not look at the barn. Not consider the acreage or calculate the market value or consult anyone's opinion. Look at the well first. Her grandfather had been a precise man. He had never once in her memory said, look at something when he meant look at something else. He had taught her that looking carefully was itself a skill, that most people saw the shape of a thing and stopped looking before they understood what the thing actually was. She picked up the coin jar and counted what was in it. She did this slowly, organizing the coins by denomination, counting each stack twice. When she was finished, she had the exact figure she had known she would have before she started, because she always knew exactly what was in the jar, down to the last cent. It was not enough. It might just barely, depending on the mail coach fare to Denver and the cost of a night's lodging, be exactly enough. The margin was so thin it was more a matter of faith than arithmetic. But Della had learned that there were times when you could not afford to wait for the arithmetic to improve, and that waiting in those cases had its own cost. She set the jar back on the table and lay back on the cot with her boots still on, and stared at the sloping ceiling and thought about her grandfather's hands. She had made her decision by the time the lamp oil burned low. She did not dress it up as courage or frame it as a choice between futures. It was simpler than that. Gideon had told her to look at the well. Gideon had never once told her to look at something that was not worth looking at. That was the whole of the calculation, and it was enough. She would go. She went to Mrs. Bodine the next morning before the first loads were started, and asked for a week's absence unpaid beginning Friday. Mrs. Bodine listened to this request with the expression she used for all requests that inconvenienced her, which was no expression at all, which was itself a kind of answer. She said she would consider it. By noon, she said yes, but that Della should understand the work would not wait for her, and if she was not back within the week, the position would go to someone who was. Della understood. She said so and went back to the ringer. It was on Wednesday, 2 days before she planned to leave, that the other thing happened. The thing that changed what she thought she knew about the situation in Black Fur Valley. Mrs. Bodine was updating her accounts ledger after the afternoon rush when she mentioned it, the way she mentioned most things, without particular emphasis, as though the information were simply another entry in the ledger, and she was reading it aloud for the record. A man had come into the laundry on Monday, she said, while Della had been out delivering the Harwick order. He had asked after the Crane property at Black Fur Valley. He said he was looking into the matter of the estate on behalf of a land concern and wanted to know if the heir had been located and informed. Della's hands stopped on the sheet she was folding. What was his name, she asked. Bodine looked at a note on the corner of her ledger page. Vane, she said. Silas Vane. Of Vane Land and Survey out of Butte. She had told him she knew nothing about the Crane estate, and he had thanked her politely and left. Della finished folding the sheet. She stacked it with the others. She said nothing further about it, and Mrs. Bodine, apparently satisfied that she had discharged her informational obligation, returned to her ledger. But Della stood for a moment with her hands flat on the stack of folded linen and thought about what that meant. A land broker from Butte had been asking after the Crane property before Della had even told anyone she was going, before the week's absence had been requested or granted, before she had done anything at all except receive a letter and count coins in a jar. Someone had known about the property before she had known what to do with it, and that someone had made inquiries, and the inquiries had been framed as estate business, which was a particular way of framing things that suggested a particular kind of interest. She did not know anything about Silas Vane. She did not know what he wanted or what he had already done or what he believed his claim to anything in Black Fir Valley to be. But she knew that her grandfather had told her not to let anyone tell her what something was worth before she had looked at it herself. And she knew that someone had already been looking. And she knew that knowledge and hers did not yet match. That was the shape of the problem, and it was enough of a shape to work with. She left on the Friday mail coach before first light with the coin jar emptied into the inside pocket of her coat, the envelope of letters in her breast pocket, and a canvas bag over one shoulder, containing 3 days of food, a change of clothes, and the small folding knife her father had given her before he died, which she carried not for protection in any practical sense, but because it was the last object she owned that had been given to her by someone who had meant to see her grow up. The other passengers on the coach were a cattle broker who smelled of pipe smoke and fell asleep within the first 10 minutes, and a woman of about 40 wrapped in a heavy wool blanket who stared at the window in a way that suggested she was not actually looking at the passing darkness, but at something a considerable distance further out. Della watched the dark shapes of pines moving past the glass and felt for the first time in a long while, not peaceful exactly, but aimed. She was aimed at something. She was going toward it with both eyes open. That was all she had ever needed, really. A direction and her eyes. The coach reached Deaver by mid-morning, and she transferred to a hire wagon going north and west toward the valley, driven by a boy of about 16 who knew where Black Fir Valley was, and delivered her to the edge of the road that turned off toward the property with a nod and a 2-word assessment of the place that matched everything she had already heard. Not much, he said. She thanked him and picked up her bag and walked the 1/4 mile down the track to the farm. Cecil Harmon was waiting at the edge of the property with his hat in his hands. He was a weathered man of about 55, lean and deliberate in his movements, with a face that had spent decades outdoors and showed it not unpleasantly in the way that outdoor faces often carry a kind of settled honesty that indoor faces sometimes lack. He ran a feed operation 2 miles east. Della knew from the county clerk's letter, and he had been the one to find Gideon on the morning of the 4th and send word to Silver Creek. He had come to offer a few words of condolence and be on his way. That was clear from the way he held himself slightly braced for a short conversation, prepared for the practical and uncomfortable geometry of comforting a stranger over a death he had been closer to than she had. But he stood a good while after his first words were done, hat turning slowly in his hands, looking out at the property rather than at her. Gideon was a private man, he said at last, but deliberate. Everything he built on purpose. He paused. I never understood half of what he put into this land. He looked toward the barn. I always figured somebody eventually would. Della thanked him for finding Gideon and for sending word and for meeting her today. She asked if he would be available over the next few days if she had practical questions, and he said yes without hesitation, which she noted and did not forget. Then she turned and looked at the farm. It announced its failure from 100 yards out plainly, without apology, the way failing things often do when they have been failing long enough to stop being embarrassed about it. The outbuilding on the north side had collapsed not gradually or partially, but decisively. One wall caved entirely inward, and the roof laid over it at an angle that suggested it had been relieved to stop standing. The barn was upright, but its boards had weathered to a gray so deep it was almost silver, and two of the upper planks on the south face had sprung their nails and hung at angles that told you something about what the winters here did to wood that was not maintained. The yard between the structures was frozen mud and sparse dead grass, and the cold that came down the valley in long level sweeps found every gap in Della's coat and introduced itself with the thoroughness of something that has had a great deal of practice. She stood at the edge of the property for a moment and let herself feel the disappointment fully. She had learned this from experience the hard way that swallowed disappointment did not go away. It went down, and it stayed down, and it came back up later heavier, usually at a time when you were least able to carry it. Better to feel it now cleanly and put it where it belonged, which was behind her, and move forward. She picked up her bag and walked toward the barn. The door was still on its hinges, which felt like a small mercy, and she took it as one without examining the feeling too closely. Inside, the light came through the sprung upper planks in two thin, cold slabs that crossed the floor at low angles and did not illuminate much. The smell was old hay and mouse and the particular cold dust of a structure that has been closed more than it has been open. A rusted pitchfork leaned against the far wall. Iron hooks on the interior posts, 6 of them evenly spaced. A milking stool near the back with one leg cracked through at the joint sitting at a permanent tilt it had apparently made peace with. She went through the barn slowly and methodically, the way her grandfather had taught her to go through any space, not looking for what you expect to find, but looking at what is actually there. She ran her palm along the walls and felt the boards beneath the weathered surface, solid, dense, old-growth timber, the kind that was already scarce by 1884, dried over decades to a hardness that newer lumber would not achieve in half a century. Someone had built this barn to last considerably longer than it currently appeared to have lasted. The bones were sound. It was the skin that had suffered. The floor was solid throughout. She tested it in a grid pattern, pressing with her boot heel, and found no soft spots, no give-nothing that suggested rot had gotten through to the substructure. The corner where the sprung planks overhead had allowed water in was the only area of concern, and she noted it and stepped back and looked up at the gap where the planks had pulled away from the fascia board. A repair, not a replacement. The work was difficult alone, but not impossible given the right approach. She would need help with the height. She came back outside and looked at the collapsed outbuilding and decided there was nothing in it worth salvaging at the present time, and that it was better counted as a future task than a present one. She walked the perimeter of the property, moving along the edge of the 40 acres with the almanac pace of someone reading a document they intend to understand, rather than merely finish. The valley floor surprised her. The soil under the frost where she crouched and broke a clod with her fingers was dark, almost brown-black dense, and mineral, the kind of earth that held what it was given. The lower acre along the creek was better still, a clay loam that her grandfather's teaching identified immediately as the best ground on the property for root crops and grain. The creek along the northern edge was still partly iced at the edges, but running clearly in the center, which meant water available in summer without hauling from the well. The fir wood on the eastern slope was thick and accessible, and she could see where Gideon had already cleared a skid trail in the timber and stacked seasoned rounds against the east wall of the barn under a canvas that had weathered but held. He had thought about fuel. He had thought about water. He had thought about soil. He had been thinking about this land in a particular deliberate way for a long time, and the thinking had left marks if you knew what to look for. And then she walked to the well. It stood in the center of the yard, and it was the kind of stonework that told you something about the person who had built it before you knew anything else about them. The stones were rough-cut granite not dressed smooth on the outside, which was a choice, not a limitation, because the interior face of each course was dressed to a precision that Della could see when she leaned over the rim. Level and close-fitted, the mortar in the joints thin and even. This was the work of someone who understood that the inside of a structure was more important than the outside, that the part that did the actual work deserved more care than the part that was merely seen. The frame above the well was old, weathered darker than the barn boards, the crossbeam carrying a crack that had been there long enough to gray over and smooth. Ordinary, expected. The kind of thing you would walk past without stopping, except for the rope. Della stopped 2 feet from the well and looked at the rope the way her grandfather had taught her to look at anything that did not fit, without assumption, from the outside in. The rope was new, not merely newer than the frame, new. Clean hemp tightly laid, the fibers still showing their natural pale color. The surface barely weathered, perhaps 1 season at most of exposure. Someone had replaced this rope within the last year. Her grandfather had replaced this rope within the last year, which meant her grandfather had used this well within the last year, which meant there was water here, and which meant that on the day he had last stood at this well and run a new rope through the old iron ring on the crossbeam, he had done it knowing it would matter to someone who came after him. She looked down into the shaft. The stone was dry and moss-free for the first several feet, then dropped into a darkness her eyes could not immediately resolve. But the air that rose from the shaft was not the flat mineral emptiness of a dry hole. It was cool and moving and carried something living in it. The faint mineral freshness of underground water, the particular smell of stone that has been in contact with moisture for a very long time. Not stagnant, moving. She straightened and looked at the stonework of the well frame again, this time not at the rope, but at the stones themselves, at the mortar. The mortar in most of the courses was old dark, with age contracted slightly into the joints, in the way that old mortar contracts as it dries and settles over years. But on the eastern side of the well, at roughly knee height, There was a section where the mortar was noticeably lighter in color. Not fresh, but fresher. A few years old at most. Someone had repointed this section of the well within recent memory. She crouched and ran her finger along the joint line of the lighter mortar and felt the texture of it finer and less gritty than the old mortar on either side. And there on the face of one of the stones in the second course, so small and worn that she might have passed it over without the particular quality of attention her grandfather had spent years teaching her a mark. Cut deliberately with a sharp tool worn smooth with age, but still legible. Two joined circles overlapping at the center. The same mark Gideon had pressed into the wax when he sealed his letters. Della sat back on her heels in the frozen mud and looked at the mark for a long time. Her grandfather had put his signature on a stone in the wall of his own well, not where anyone would see it standing upright. You had to crouch to find it. You had to be looking for something rather than just looking. She stood and took hold of the rope. The rope went slack at first, then tightened as she began to pull. And what struck her immediately was the direction of the tension. Not straight down the way a rope to a bucket goes down, and then slightly angled by the swing and the water's resistance. The tension came from an angle. The rope ran diagonally downward, hugging the inner wall of the shaft on the eastern side, and the weight at the other end was not the weight of a bucket. It was heavier, and it moved with a different character, not swinging freely the way a bucket swings, but shifting with a dull, mechanical deliberateness, like something sliding rather than hanging. She let the rope back down slowly and leaned further over the rim, letting her eyes fully adjust to the low light of the shaft. The eastern wall of the shaft, from about 4 feet below the rim to a depth she could not fully see, was not uniformly stone. There was a section, perhaps 2 feet wide by 3 feet tall, where the surface was set slightly differently. The facing stones fitted flush, but the mortar at their edges showing the same lighter color as the section she had found outside. And at the center of this section, almost invisible unless you were looking directly at it, 2 small iron hinges set flush with the stone face, and a length of rope threaded through a hole bored through the center. A door. A door built into the wall of a well shaft, counterweighted, designed to be raised and lowered by the rope on the frame above. Della held the rim with both hands and looked at it for a full minute without moving. The cold air from the shaft moved against her face. Her grandfather had not built a well. He had built a well around something else. She found the access point after another quarter hour of methodical searching, moving in a slow circle around the well base, pressing with her boots, looking for anything that did not behave the way frozen ground was supposed to behave. She found it on the eastern side of the well, surround a stone slab that lay inside a low ring of granite she had taken for a drainage lip when she first walked by. The slab was recessed, not mortared to the ones around it, and when she worked her cold fingers under its eastern edge and pulled, it rose smoothly balanced on a counterweighted hinge of its own that Gideon had built into the frame below, a hinge so well balanced that the slab, which must have weighed close to 100 pounds, required no more effort to lift than a door that has been properly hung. Beneath it, a passage, wide enough to take a person sideways, Stone steps cut directly into the earth, descending at a gentle angle into darkness below. And from the passage moving against her face as clearly as a hand laid against her cheek, came warm air. Warm. Not the cold mineral smell of underground stone. Warm and living and carrying the sound distant constant of moving water. Della knelt at the edge of the opening for a moment. The cold of the yard was at her back. The warmth from below moved around her. She thought of her grandfather's hands, deliberate and careful, moving with intention toward everything they touched. She thought of the two joined circles cut into the stone. She thought of the letter in her breast pocket, 2 years old, patient as the work it had been written to accompany. She took her lantern from the canvas bag and struck a match and lit it. The flame was steady in the still air of the passage. Then she picked up her bag and went down. The steps were 12 in number, each one cut clean, and even the risers consistent in height. The way they are when a person who understands what they are building takes the time to measure rather than guess. At the bottom, the passage turned at a right angle and then opened, and Della stopped at the threshold and did not move for a long time. She had not known what she was expecting. Something smaller, perhaps. Something more modest, more consistent with the idea of a secret kept by a man who had not by anyone's accounting been particularly prosperous or particularly remarkable. A cache, maybe. A hiding place. Something that would require a few minutes to understand and a few more to feel properly grateful for. What she found instead was a room. It was large, 20 feet across at its widest, with a ceiling that rose to 8 feet at the center and curved down toward the stone walls in a way that made the space feel like the interior of something deliberate and safe. Something that had been shaped with care rather than excavated out of necessity. The walls were natural limestone, pale gray-white rough, but clean. The floor was planked wide pine boards fitted close, and even the wood dry and sound, slightly dusty from disuse, but not rotted, not soft anywhere. The lantern light moved across it and showed a surface that had been finished and maintained, boards fitted with the precision of someone who understood that a floor was not merely a convenience but the foundation of a habitable life. Along 3 walls, shelves, built in tiers, solid and square, stocked with the patient accumulation of years. Sealed crocks and labeled tins and folded cloth and bundled tools, each in its place. Each section marked with a small handwritten card in the cramped, careful script she had known since childhood. An iron hearth sat against the far wall, a proper Franklin design, its pipe running up through the rock ceiling in a shaft that she could not yet trace, but that clearly led somewhere above. And in the far corner, tucked back as though privacy were a thing worth respecting, even underground, a small structure, a cabin within the room. Its walls were milled timber, proper framing lumber, the boards planed smooth. Its door was fitted with a proper iron latch. A curtain of quilted cotton hung in its single small window, which was built not to look outside, because there was no outside here, but to give the room inside a face, to make it a room rather than a box. Behind the cabin, moving through a narrow channel cut in the limestone floor, a thread of clear water ran from a crack in the wall and disappeared through a drainage cut in the boards. Its sound small and constant and utterly steady. The sound of something that had been running patiently for decades, without asking to be noticed, without requiring anything, simply giving what it had to give to whoever was present to receive it. Della stood in the entrance for a full minute without speaking, because there was no one to speak to, and nothing she could have said that would have been adequate. The lantern light filled the room with a warmth that was not only warmth that carried in it the accumulated intention of a man who had worked alone in this space for 40 winters, who had fitted each board and set each stone and organized each shelf, knowing that none of it would be used by him. On the nearest shelf, propped against a tin of lamp oil, was an envelope. Her name on the front. Her grandfather's hand. She crossed the room in 4 steps. She picked it up and held it for a moment against her chest before she opened it. Her hands were not quite steady, which was the most honest thing about her in that particular moment. "Welcome home, Della girl," it began. She read the letter standing up because she forgot to sit down. It was 2 pages written small, the ink still dark and clear, preserved by the dry warmth of the underground air. He explained everything the spring he had found when he was digging what he had meant to be a root cellar. 40 years ago, in the summer before the first hard winter he had spent on that land alone. He explained the work, the slow accumulation of it, one winter at a time, one course of stone at a time, building towards something he could not be certain would ever be found, only certain that it needed to exist. "I could not give you a head start in the world the easy way," the letter said. "So I built you one underground, and hoped you would be brave enough to find it. You found it. That means I was right about you, which should not surprise you, because I was almost always right about the things that mattered." She read that line twice. Then she laughed alone in the underground room, a sound that surprised her by its completeness, by how much of her it came from. He had been right about her. She had come. She had looked at the well first. She had looked carefully. And she was standing in the evidence of 40 years of a man's love, expressed in the only language he had ever been fully fluent, in which was the language of work done right, of things built to last, of preparation, laid down against a future he would not live to see, but had trusted completely to be worth preparing for. She stood in the warm light of her grandfather's room and understood, perhaps for the first time fully, what it meant to be known by someone. Not flattered or reassured or told what you hoped to hear, but actually known, understood in the specific terms of your actual capacities, trusted with something real rather than offered something comfortable. Gideon Crane had not left her a farm. He had left her a foundation. The difference between those 2 things was the difference between being given a fish and being given 40 years of someone's most careful thought about how to teach you to live near water. She sat down on the floor of the room finally, because the standing had become unnecessary, and she sat for a long time in the warmth and the quiet and the steady sound of the spring, reading the letter again and again in the lantern light, touching the words with her eyes, the way her grandfather had touched things with his hands, deliberately, with full attention, understanding what she was being given. Outside, above the stone slab above the well, and its new rope and its counterweighted door, The February cold moved down the valley in its long level sweeps and found nothing it could reach. Below the frost, below the bare mud and the dead grass and the failed-looking farm, the spring ran on in its limestone channel, patient and clear, and completely indifferent to winter as it had been running for longer than anyone now living could remember, as it would continue to run long after this particular February had dissolved into the general past of the world. And in a corner of the room her grandfather had built for her over 40 winters, Della Crane sat with his letter in her hands and breathed air that was warm and moving and alive, and did not feel for the first time in more years than she could accurately count, like someone who was just barely keeping herself from falling through the ice. She felt instead like someone who had finally found out where the ice was thin and where it was solid, and who had, without quite planning it, been standing on the solid part all along. She would not go back to Silver Creek. She had known it from the moment she had descended the steps. She did not dramatize the decision or examine it from multiple angles. It was not that kind of decision. It was the kind of decision that has already been made by the time you notice you are making it, the kind that arrives not as a choice between two futures, but as a recognition of the future that was already true. She climbed back up the stone stairs with the lantern and came out into the last of the gray February afternoon. The cold hit her face, and she stood beside the well for a moment and looked out at the 40 acres in the low light, at the dark fir trees on the eastern slope and the frozen creek along the north and the barn that was mostly sound and the yard that needed work and the property that most people in Silver Creek had already written off as a ruin. Then she went back into the barn and found the small desk she had noticed against the far wall. An old plank desk with 2 drawers solid despite its plain construction, and she sat down at it and took paper from her bag and wrote 2 things. The first was a letter to Mrs. Bodine. It was short. She thanked the woman for the employment and said she would not be returning at the end of the week. She wished her well. She sealed it with wax from a stub of candle she found on the desk. The second thing she wrote was not a letter. It was a list. The list had 2 columns. The first column was titled, "What I Have." The second column was titled, "What I Need." The first column was, when she finished filling it in, considerably longer than she had expected. The second column had 1 item at the top that nothing in the first column could address, which was the matter of the barn roof and the question of working at height alone. She set the list on the desk and looked at it for a while. Then she folded the letter to Mrs. Bodine and put it in her bag for the morning post and sat in the darkening barn in the particular quiet of a person who has made a large decision and is now simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up to it. Below the yard, the spring ran on. The coin jar, sitting empty now in the pocket of her coat, had at last served its full purpose. The second morning on the property, Della woke before light. She had slept in the underground cabin on the narrow bed frame with the straw mattress and the cedar-scented quilt, and the sleep had been the kind she had not had in years, deep and uninterrupted and complete. The kind of sleep that is possible only when the body finally believes it is somewhere safe. She lay still for a moment after waking in the warm dark, listening to the spring run its quiet commentary through the limestone channel, and felt the unfamiliar weight of having slept enough. The lantern on the small shelf above the bed had burned out sometime in the night. She relit it from the matches in the oilcloth box on the supply shelf, and sat on the edge of the bed and read her grandfather's letter again in the steady flame. She had read it 6 times now. Each reading gave her something the previous one had not, the way careful readings of careful writing tend to do. The first reading had given her the shape of what he had built. The second had given her the emotion of it, the fullness of what 40 years of quiet intention actually looked like from the inside. The third and fourth had begun to give her the practical information, the specifics of the water source, the stocking of the shelves, the logic of the drainage system. He had cut into the floor. The fifth had given her something she had not expected, which was a sense of his voice, the way the letter sounded like him in a way that his shorter correspondence had never quite managed, as though the size of what he had been carrying had required more words to set down than he had usually allowed himself. The sixth reading gave her the paragraph she had not fully absorbed before. It was near the bottom of the second page, in a section she had moved through quickly the first several times, because her attention had already been captured by what came before it. The handwriting in this section was slightly smaller than the rest, as though he had reached the end of his planned space and was fitting these words in with the care of someone who knows they are not running short of things to say, but of room to say them. He wrote, "There is also the matter of the water rights. I registered the spring with the Beaver County office in the fall of 1879 under my name and attached to this property. The paperwork is in the county record. The spring feeds the east fork of the valley drainage, which 3 other properties depend on in dry years, and there have been more dry years lately than wet ones. I did not advertise this fact. Some things are better known quietly. You will understand, I think, why I kept it to myself, and you will know when the time comes whether and how to use it." Della read the paragraph twice, then set the letter down on the quilt and looked at the flame of the lantern. Water rights. In Montana in 1884, water was not a convenience. It was not infrastructure. It was the difference between a farm that functioned and a farm that failed, between a valley that could sustain settlement and one that could not, between land that had a future and land that was a story people told about a place that had once been tried and given up. The winters here had grown harder in the last decade, and the summers shorter and drier, and the ranchers and small farmers in the valleys east of the divide had been feeling the change in their herds and their harvests in ways that were not yet catastrophic, but were consistently quietly worsening. A spring that fed the east fork of the valley drainage with registered water rights attached to this property was not a curiosity. It was not an interesting geological feature. It was a legal and practical claim on something that multiple other landholders needed, and that need would only grow. Her grandfather had known this. He had known it in 1879 when he registered the rights, and he had said nothing about it to anyone. And he had continued saying nothing about it for 5 years, until he was dead, and the letter was open and the information arrived in the hands of the one person he had decided to trust with it. Della sat in the warm underground room and understood with a clarity that arrived all at once, rather than gradually, why the farm at Black Fur Valley had appeared to be worth so little, and had attracted the attention of a land broker from Butte before the body of its owner was properly in the ground. She got up and dressed and went to the supply shelves. The shelves were the second revelation of the farm after the room itself. She had done a preliminary inventory the evening before, moving along the tiers with the lantern and her paper and pencil, noting what she found in each section, without yet trying to assess the full meaning of it. Now, in the careful morning quiet, she went through them properly. The food stores were organized by category and labeled in Gideon's cramped hand, each crock and tin dated in the same neat figures. Dried beans in 4 varieties, lentils, oats in sealed crocks stacked 3 deep, cornmeal in tins, the oldest from 1871, the newest from the fall of 1883, a few months before he died. Dried apple rings wrapped in cloth, a tin of maple sugar sealed with wax, salt in a stone crock, more of it than she expected, which made sense when she thought about preservation, about putting up food through a winter with no access to a store. She ran her hand along the food section and did the arithmetic in her head. The stores were enough for 6 months of careful eating, perhaps more. They were organized for rotation, the oldest forward, the newest behind the cards above each section, reminding whoever used them to take from the front. He had not stocked this for himself. The quantities were too deliberate, the variety too considered. He had stocked it for a person starting something, a person who would need time before the first harvest, who could not afford to spend her first months worrying about food, while she was also worrying about everything else. The tool section was beside the food stores and occupied nearly a full wall of shelving. A hand plane, 2 chisels in a cloth roll, a wooden mallet, a small awl, a folding rule marked in both inches and feet, a coil of fine wire, a ball of waxed cord, 3 different grades of sandpaper rolled in paper tubes, a spokes half, a small draw knife, a block and tackle, the rope freshly oiled, the pulleys turning smoothly when she tested them with her finger, a set of drill bits in a leather roll, each bit nested in its own slot, and nails. An entire shelf of nails in sorted jars, each jar labeled by size, each size represented in a quantity that told her Gideon had been thinking about the barn roof and the loose boards and the maintenance of the structures above for some time before he died. She stood at the tool shelf for a long while, running her inventory pencil down the list she was making and feeling something she could not immediately name. It arrived as a tightness in her chest. That was not grief exactly, though it was close to grief's country. A kind of retroactive longing for all the things this represented. Not the objects themselves, but the years of thought behind them. The decades of a man standing in a hardware store in Deaver, or in some traveling merchant's wagon on a county road, looking at a chisel or a coil of wire, or a jar of 2-penny nails and thinking not of what he needed today, but of what someone else would need after him. That was a particular kind of love. It was the kind that required a long view and a willingness to invest in a future you would never see, and it was rarer than most people understood until they encountered it directly. and Della had encountered it directly, and she was standing in the evidence of it, and the evidence was overwhelming. She finished the tool inventory and moved to the seed section. The seeds were in a leather satchel on the lowest shelf, wrapped in individual paper packets. Inside individual oilcloth sleeves, each one labeled in the same small handwriting: onion turnip, squash lettuce, hardy rye, winter wheat, beet parsnip. On the satchel itself, pinned with a small straight pin, a card: seeds viable 3 years from pack date. Plant rye first along the creek bank, all others after last frost. Do not rush the lettuce. She read that last line twice. Do not rush the lettuce. The specificity of it, the particular practical care of a man who had grown lettuce in this valley and knew what happened when you planted it too early. A man who was not here to tell her himself, and had therefore written it down, trusting her to find it and trust it. She set the satchel back on the shelf and picked up the almanac from the cabin's bedside shelf. The 1879 farming almanac, with its strips of folded paper, marking certain pages in its margins filled with Gideon's annotations in pencil. She carried it to the small table in the main room and sat down with it in the lantern light, and read the margin notes in the sections he had marked. Ada's spring planting in this valley runs 2 weeks later than the almanac advises. Do not be impatient. She noted that he had written Ada once, then struck it through and written Della above it in darker pencil, then struck that out too. She looked at the strike-through for a moment and thought of him sitting somewhere, lamp-lit, almanac open, deciding what to call her in a letter she would not read for years, trying out her name against the page, trying it again, getting it right on the second try, which seemed about right for a man like him. The practical problem reasserted itself mid-morning when she climbed the stone stairs and came out into the thin winter light and stood in the yard and looked at the barn roof. The 2 sprung planks on the south face were worse than they had looked from below. She could see from the yard that the gap where they had pulled away from the fascia was wide enough to have admitted water for more than 1 season. And the darkening of the boards around the gap told her that the wood in that section had been cycling between wet and dry for long enough that the cellular structure of it would be compromised whether or not it had yet gone soft to the touch. She needed to get up there and assess it from above before she could know how bad it was, and she could not get up there alone with any safety, because the angle of the roof and the height of the eaves combined to make solo work at that section genuinely dangerous. She walked to the base of the barn and looked up. 14 feet to the eaves. The gap was another 3 feet above that. Even with the block and tackle from the supply shelf rigged to give her a work platform, she could not manage the height safely alone. She needed a second pair of hands, and she needed them before the next rain, which in this valley at this time of year was not a matter of weeks but of days. She thought about Cecil Harmon. She thought about the note in Gideon's letter, the line she had read and filed and not yet acted on. Cecil Harmon is a decent man. He knows the property, and I have asked him to help whoever comes to claim it. He has agreed. You may trust him with practical matters. She had already spoken with Harmon once briefly at the edge of the property. He had been kind without being effusive, which she respected. He had offered availability if she had questions, which she had noted, but she had not yet asked him for anything specific, partly because it was early, and partly because she had been raised in the particular school of self-sufficiency that teaches you not incorrectly that depending on others is a liability, and that the fewer liabilities you carry, the better. She also knew, standing in the yard, looking at the barn roof, that this particular version of pride was going to cost her the barn corner if she let it run past another week. And losing the barn corner would eventually compromise the wall. And losing the wall would compromise the whole structure. And the barn was the one above-ground structure that made the farm viable as a farm. The arithmetic of that was clear, and Della was very good at arithmetic. She went back inside and added a line to the list she had started the previous evening. She wrote it in the second column under What I Need. Ask Harmon about the barn roof. She would ask Harmon. She would not wait. She would ask him the way her grandfather had apparently asked him for things directly and practically, without packaging the request in more ceremony than it required. That decision was still sitting cleanly in her mind when she heard the sound of boots on the frozen yard. She came to the barn door and looked out and saw a man coming down the track from the road. Not Harmon. Harmon was broader in the shoulder and moved differently. This man was leaner, dressed well for someone calling on a piece of land that everyone said was worthless. His coat a good wool, his boots clean despite the frozen mud of the track. He was perhaps 45 years old, clean-shaven, and he walked with the particular unhurried confidence of someone who has arrived at a great many places before and has never once been turned away from any of them. He carried a leather document case under his left arm. His right hand he kept free. Della stepped out of the barn and stood in the yard and waited for him to come to her, which he did, covering the last 50 yards of ground with an easy stride, and stopping at a distance that was polite without being deferential. The distance of a man who has calibrated the geometry of these arrivals many times. "Miss Crane," he said, "my name is Silas Vane." He said it the way people say names they expect to be recognized, with a slight pause after leaving space for the recognition to arrive. She said nothing. She waited. He opened the document case and produced a folded paper, held it toward her. When she did not move to take it immediately, he held it steady, patient as though he had all the time available and was not particularly invested in which of them moved first. "I represent Vane Land and Survey out of Butte," he said. "We have an interest in this property that predates your grandfather's recent arrangements." He paused. "There is a signed agreement dated June 1882 between Gideon Crane and a representative of my company. A preliminary sales agreement witnessed and notarized conveying the intent to sell this property at terms agreed upon at that time." Della looked at the paper he was holding. She did not take it. "If that agreement is valid," he said, "and I believe it is the subsequent recording of your name as heir, represents a material conflict with a prior legal commitment. I am not here to cause trouble, Miss Crane. I'm here to resolve this in a way that is fair and straightforward." He paused again. "The company is prepared to honor the terms of the original agreement and to ensure that you receive reasonable compensation for any inconvenience the estate process has caused. The words were smooth and carefully arranged the way words are when they have been used before on other people. In other cold yards outside other failing-looking farms, Della had never heard this particular arrangement of words before, but she recognized its structure. The way she recognized the structure of a crooked ledger. Not from experience with this specific version of the fraud, but from a general familiarity with the ways in which numbers could be arranged to tell a story that served the arranger rather than the truth. She said, "May I see the agreement?" He handed it over. She unfolded it and read it carefully. The way she read everything from beginning to end without skimming, without rushing. The paper was correct in its physical appearance, properly formatted, the language of it, legal and specific. The date was June 14th, 1882. There was a signature at the bottom of the second page, above the printed name, Gideon R. Crane, and a notary stamp from Deaver County, and the signature of a witness she did not recognize. She looked at the signature above her grandfather's printed name for a long time. She had been reading Gideon Crane's handwriting since she was old enough to receive letters. She had read his writing on envelopes and on pages, and on the cards above the supply shelves, and in the margins of the almanac, and on the face of a stone set into the wall of his own well. She had read enough of it that she knew the specific character of it, not just the general shapes of letters, but the particular habits of a hand that had written the same way for decades. The slight forward lean, the way he formed the capital C in his own name with a small squared-off serif at the top, that was entirely his own. Not a taught form, but a developed one. The kind of idiosyncrasy that lives in a hand the way dialect lives in a voice. The signature on the paper in her hands did not have that serif. The C in Crane was smooth at the top, rounded the way a person copies a letter form they have seen but do not habitually use. Everything else about the signature was close enough to pass a casual inspection. But the C was wrong. She refolded the paper and handed it back. She said, "My grandfather did not sign this." Vane received the paper without expression. He looked at her for a moment with a quality of attention that was neither hostile nor warm, simply evaluative, the look of someone recalibrating their approach based on information they had not anticipated needing. "That is a serious claim, Miss Crane," he said. "The document is notarized. It has a witness." She said, "I understand what it has." A notarized document with a witness signature, he said, carries legal weight that a young woman's opinion about her grandfather's handwriting does not. He said it without particular cruelty, as a statement of practical fact, in the same tone he had used for everything else. The even tone was perhaps the most unpleasant part of it. The implication that what he was doing was so ordinary, so established, so well rehearsed that it did not even require the energy of hostility. "I am giving you 10 days, he said, "to consider your position and make arrangements. If you are still on this property in 10 days, the matter will proceed through the county court, which will take time and cost money that I suspect you do not have." He closed the document case. "If you leave willingly, the company is still prepared to offer compensation." He named a figure. It was not a small figure relative to what Della had been earning at the laundry. It was also not a figure that anyone who understood the actual value of the water rights registered to this property in 1879 would have offered to someone they believed had a legitimate claim. He put on his hat and walked back up the track toward the road, unhurried, not looking back, with the bearing of a man who has had many of these conversations and has learned that the looking back is never necessary. Della stood in the yard and watched him go. The cold moved down the valley in its long level sweeps, and the fir trees on the eastern slope held their dark shapes against the pale winter sky, and the creek ran its muffled sound beneath the ice at its edges, and nothing in the physical world had changed in the last 20 minutes. And yet everything in Della's understanding of her situation had shifted by several degrees. She went back into the barn and sat on the plank floor with her back against the wall and the list in her lap, and thought carefully. Vane had known about the property before the estate was settled. He had made inquiries at Bodine's laundry before Della had announced her plans to anyone. He had arrived at the farm on the second morning of her presence here, with a prepared document and a prepared argument, and a figure already calculated, which meant he had been watching this property for some time, which meant the interest was not casual, which meant the property was worth considerably more than its assessed value, which she had already suspected, and which the water rights, once she had thought them through, confirmed. The signature was wrong. She was certain of it with the particular certainty that comes not from guessing, but from knowledge, from years of reading the same hand on the same page. But certainty and proof were two different instruments, and she had only one of them. What she needed was the other. She thought about her grandfather's letter, not the first page which she had memorized, but the second. The section she had read carefully that morning before the inventory, the paragraph about the water rights and the county record, and the line she had read and noted, "I did not advertise this fact. Some things are better known quietly." Gideon had not advertised the water rights, but he had registered them. He had filed paperwork. He had created a record that existed in the county office in Deaver, that had existed there since 1879, that predated the alleged sales agreement of 1882 by 3 years. A man who had quietly registered water rights in 1879 and then in 1882, been approached by a land company that wanted to buy his property, would have understood what the approach was about. He would have understood what the company knew and what they wanted and why. And a man who understood all of that and still did not sell, who wrote his granddaughter a letter the same year, telling her to look at the well. First, who built a lift into the shaft wall and a door into the stone, and a counterweighted slab over the entrance, and a room behind all of it, who stocked that room over 40 winters with everything a person needed to build a life, was a man who had thought about the future of this property in very specific terms. He had thought about someone coming after him with a document. She was not ready to believe yet that he had left her a specific answer to Silas Vane. That felt like too neat a resolution, too much like the kind of story that tied its knots too conveniently. But she was also standing in the evidence of a man who had anticipated almost everything else with a precision that continued to surprise her, even now that she was looking for it and she thought it was worth going back into the room and reading the letter again. All of it more slowly than she had read it before. She descended the stone stairs and sat at the small table in the main room with the letter and the lantern and the almanac and the inventory list, and she read everything again from the beginning. She was on the second page, moving slowly through the section about the spring and the water rights, when she found the line she had read quickly and moved past. It was small, placed between two longer paragraphs about the practical management of the spring drainage, easy to slide over if you were reading for the major points rather than the minor ones. He had written, "The drawer beneath the floorboard in the cabin holds documents you may someday need to hold your ground. I hope you never need them. But if you do, they will be there." Della set the letter down and looked at the cabin door. She crossed the room in 3 steps and opened the cabin door and went to the bed and crouched beside it and pressed her palms to the floorboards. She moved along the boards systematically, pressing each one, feeling for the one that gave differently than the others. The 4th board from the wall had a slight give that the others did not rot. Not weakness, but the engineered give of a board that is not nailed at one end but hinged. She got the folding knife from her bag and worked the blade into the seam at the loose end of the board and pried it up. Beneath it, a space perhaps 8 inches deep, lined with a flat piece of tin to keep moisture from the earth below. And sitting in the space, a tin box of the kind used for storing legal documents. The lid fitted close and tight, the metal still clean and uncorroded in the dry underground air. She lifted it out and set it on the bed and opened it. Inside 3 items. The first was a document 4 pages folded once on the official paper of the Beaver County Recorder's Office, with the county seal embossed in the upper left corner. It was the original registration of the water rights filed October 1879, signed by Gideon Ruford Crane, and countersigned by the county recorder Aldous R. Webb, with the official stamp of the office pressed into the paper at the bottom of the final page. The registration was specific and detailed, describing the spring location, the drainage path, the affected properties downstream, the terms of the rights registration. It was as far as Della could determine exactly what Gideon had described in his letter. A legal claim on the water source filed and recorded attached to the property. The second item was a letter, not a long one. 1 page dated September 12, 1882, written in Gideon's hand on plain paper. It was addressed to Aldous Webb at the county recorder's office. Its language was direct and plain. "I am writing to formally decline the proposal made by representatives of Vaneland and Survey of Butte on August 30th of this year regarding the purchase of my property at Black Fir Valley. I have not signed and will not sign any agreement conveying this property or the water rights attached to it to any party. If any such document should appear bearing my name, it is not valid, and it does not represent my intention." At the bottom of the page below Gideon's signature, in a different hand and a different ink, a single sentence: "Received and filed September 17th, 1882. A. Webb, County Recorder, Beaver." Webb had received the letter. Webb had filed it. The filing date was September 1882, 3 months after the date on the sales agreement Vane had shown her this morning. The third item in the tin box was a single piece of paper, folded small, clearly not intended for anyone else. Just a note, the kind you write for yourself when you want to remember something clearly. The handwriting was Gideon's, and the paper was the same kind he used for his letters. And it said in its entirety, "Vane came again. Brought a different man this time. More papers, more talk. I told him no, the same way. I tell the frost no, by building something it cannot get through. The spring is mine and Della's after me, and that will not change." He had not signed it. He had not needed to. It was not written for anyone else. It was written for the record of his own mind, the note of a man who had looked at the situation clearly and made his decision and set it down so he could look at it again and know he had been right. Della sat on the edge of the bed in the underground cabin and held the three items in her lap and looked at the flame of the lantern. She had come to Black Fir Valley on the strength of 3 lines in a letter. She had found a room. She had found a spring. She had found a water rights registration and a letter from her grandfather to the county recorder, specifically declining to sell this property, and specifically noting that any sales document bearing his name was not valid. Filed and stamped and received by the county office in September 1882. 3 months after the date on the document Silas Vane had brought to her yard this morning. Gideon Crane had not just refused Vane. He had documented the refusal. He had created a paper trail that answered the paper trail that preceded it and undermined it, that had been sitting in the county records for 2 years, waiting for the moment it was needed. And he had kept copies of everything in a tin box under a floorboard in a room that no one except Della was ever going to find. She thought of the note. I told him no, the same way I tell the frost no, by building something it cannot get through. Her grandfather had not been a man who used language carelessly. When he wrote something down, even a private note, even a note to himself in the small hours of some autumn evening when the cold was coming down the valley, and the work was long and the outcome uncertain, he had meant exactly what he said and had chosen his words accordingly. He had built something frost could not get through. He had built it for 40 winters, 1 stone at a time, and it was still here, and it was warm, and the spring ran through it as clear and steady as it had run the day he found it. And Della Crane was sitting in it with the evidence in her lap. She put the 3 documents back in the tin box and closed the lid and slid it inside her canvas bag. She sat for another minute in the quiet, listening to the spring. Then she went to the supply shelf and found the paper she had been using for lists and sat at the small table and wrote a letter to Cecil Harmon. She thanked him for his offer of assistance and said she had 2 things she needed to discuss with him. The first being the barn roof, which required 2 pairs of hands and which she hoped could be addressed soon, and the second being a matter she did not fully explain in the letter, but described simply as follows. I need to know what you know about Silas Vane of Vane Land and Survey. My grandfather apparently had dealings with this man. The man visited me today. I believe I know how to address the situation, but I would value your counsel before I proceed. She kept the letter short and plainly worded because Harmon was a man who, in her brief experience of him, appeared to prefer plain words to decorated ones, and because the situation itself was plain enough not to require decoration. She sealed the letter with wax and climbed the stairs and walked the 2 miles east to the Harmon feed operation in the low afternoon light, arriving as the sun went behind the valley wall and the cold deepened in the way it does when the last light goes, and the earth stops pretending it has retained any warmth from the day. Harmon came to his door and received the letter and read it standing in the doorway. He read it twice the way she read things which she noted. Then he looked up and said that he knew Silas Vane. He said it with a particular quality of quietness, the quietness of a name that carries a weight of already formed opinion. He said, "Come in out of the cold. I'll tell you what I know." She went in. A girl of 12 was sitting at the kitchen table doing sums on a piece of paper. A girl with her father's focused expression and her own sharper eyes, who looked up when Della came in and assessed her with the frank, complete attention of a child who has not yet learned to disguise curiosity as something more socially acceptable. "This is May Harmon," said. "May, this is Miss Crane. She's taken on Gideon's place." May looked at Della for another moment and then said, "Is there really something under the yard?" Harmon said her name not sharply but in the tone of a father who has learned that his daughter's observations, though accurate, do not always require immediate public confirmation. Della looked at the girl and said, "Yes, I'll show you sometime if your father allows." May returned to her sums with the satisfied expression of someone whose hypothesis has been confirmed. Harmon poured coffee and sat across from Della at the kitchen table and told her what he knew about Silas Vane, which was more than she had expected, and worse than she had hoped for. Vane had been operating in the Valley counties for at least 3 years. His method was specific and consistent. He identified properties with undervalued assets, usually water access or mineral rights that the current owners had not publicly developed, approached those owners with purchase offers, and when the offers were declined, appeared some months later with documentation suggesting a prior agreement had been reached. The documentation was detailed enough, and the legal challenge expensive enough, that most people, when faced with the choice between a court fight they could not afford and a cash offer that was real if insufficient, chose the cash. 2 families in the next valley east, Harmon said, had left their properties in the last 2 years. He named them. He did not say they had been cheated. He said they had made their decisions. But he said it in a way that made clear what he thought of the circumstances under which those decisions had been made. He looked at Della's face and said, "You're not going to take the offer." She said, "No." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you have?" She told him. Not everything, not the full inventory of the room or the details of the spring, but the relevant facts. The water rights registration from 1879. The letter from Gideon to the county recorder in September 1882, declining the sale and specifically noting that any document purporting to show his agreement would be invalid, and the county stamp confirming receipt and filing. She said she believed the signature on Vane's document was not her grandfather's. She said she believed the county records in Deaver would confirm everything she needed to confirm. Harmon listened to all of this without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a longer moment than the first one. Then he said, "Aldous Webb is still the county recorder in Deaver. Been in that office going on 15 years. She said, "I know." He said, "You're gonna go see him yourself." She said, "Yes." He said, "You don't want me to come with you." She thought about this. The honest answer was that she did not need him to come with her, which was different from not wanting him there. But there was also something in the going alone that felt important in a way she could not yet fully articulate, something about the claim being hers, and the resolution being hers, and the whole of it being the work of the person Gideon had built the room for, rather than the work of a man who happened to be helpful. She said, "I think this one is mine to handle. But I would be grateful if you and May could help with the barn roof before it rains again." Harmon looked at her with the expression of a man who has just understood something he had been only partially comprehending before. Then he said that he and May would be at the farm on Thursday morning weather, allowing with 2 sawhorses and whatever lumber she had not already found in the stack against the barn's east wall. She thanked him and finished her coffee and walked back to the farm in the full dark, with her boots on the frozen road and the stars very bright above the valley wall, and the tin box in her canvas bag. Somewhere ahead of her below the yard and the frozen mud and the dead grass of February, the spring ran on in its limestone channel, steady and clear, and completely indifferent to everything that had been happening on the surface today, as it had been indifferent to every surface event of the last 40 years, as it would continue to be until someone chose to make it matter. Della intended to be the one who made it matter. She descended the stairs for the 3rd time that day and lit the lantern and sat at the small table and looked at the documents laid out on the surface in front of her. The water rights registration, the letter to Webb, the private note, and across the table the inventory list with its 2 columns, and the almanac with its margin notes, and the letter that began, "Welcome home, Della girl." She was 9 days from Vane's deadline. She needed one of those days for the trip to Deaver. She needed another day for the barn roof with Harmon and May. That left 7 days of ordinary work, the work of getting a farm ready for a season that did not yet know it was coming. She pulled the inventory paper toward her and began to add things to the first column. The block and tackle in the supply shelf, the nails sorted by size in their labeled jars, the seed packets wrapped in oilcloth in the leather satchel, the skid trail already cut into the eastern timber, the creek running clear along the northern edge. The list of things she had was when she wrote it out completely, and without the habit of discounting what was difficult to count considerably longer than she had allowed herself to believe before she came here. It was not long enough yet to constitute a finished life, and she knew that. But it was long enough to constitute a beginning, and she had been starting from nothing long enough to know the difference between nothing and something. And what she had now was definitively something. She closed the list and folded it and put it in her coat pocket. She made her supper from the supply shelves, a pot of oat porridge on the iron hearth, with dried apple and a spoon of maple sugar. And she ate it at the table with the almanac open beside her, reading Gideon's margin notes in the crop sections and the planting charts, hearing in the cramped, careful pencil marks the voice of a man who had spent 40 years in this valley learning its specific rhythms, and had written down what he learned so she would not have to spend 40 years learning them herself. The hearth held its warmth steadily. The spring ran its quiet sound. The lanterns cast their circles on the plank floor. In the morning she would go to Deaver. She would bring the tin box, and she would sit across from Aldous Webb in his county office, and she would lay the documents on his desk and let the record speak for what it was. But that was morning. Tonight there was the warm room and the almanac and the inventory and the sound of the spring, and those things were enough. Because they were real, and real things her grandfather had shown her were always enough. If you looked at them clearly and did not let anyone else tell you what they were worth. The morning she went to Deaver, she woke before the spring had fully announced the hour. She lay still for a moment in the underground dark, listening to the water move through its limestone channel, and ran through the sequence of what she intended to do, the way her grandfather had taught her to plan a carpentry job, not by imagining the finished result, but by naming each step in order precisely from the first action to the last, so that when you began, you were not discovering the process, but executing a plan you had already completed in your mind. Step 1, the tin box. Step 2, the hire wagon to Deaver. Step 3, the county recorder's office. Step 4, Aldous Webb. She rose and dressed in the dark and took the tin box from the canvas bag and opened it once more and looked at the 3 documents by the light of the lantern she lit from the shelf above the bed. She had looked at them 4 times since returning from Harmon's the previous evening. Not because she needed to read them again. She had the contents of each one memorized, but because there was a particular quality of reassurance in handling the actual documents, in feeling the weight of the paper, and seeing the county stamp and confirming again that the thing she was carrying was real. The letter from Gideon to Webb, dated September 1882, filed September 17th. A. Webb County Recorder, Deaver. The stamp was clear and even pressed into the paper, with the full weight of an official instrument that had been used so many times its edges had worn to a consistent impression. She closed the tin box and put it in her bag and went up the stairs. The morning was gray, and still the kind of morning that holds its breath before deciding what kind of day it intends to be. The frost on the yard caught the early light and held it in a way that made the ground look momentarily valuable, every frozen mud crystal briefly brilliant before the light moved, and the yard became simply a frozen yard again. She walked the 1/4 mile to the road without stopping and waited at the post road junction for the morning hire wagon to Deaver, which arrived 12 minutes late and smelled of horse and pine pitch and the breakfast of whoever had ridden it before her. The driver was a woman of about 60 who asked no questions and accepted the fare without comment, and handled the reins with the particular efficiency of someone who has driven this road so many times that the horses could probably manage it alone, and might on certain mornings actually be doing so. Della sat in the wagon bed with her bag in her lap and watched Black Fir Valley fall away behind her, and the road open through the timber toward Deaver, and thought about nothing in particular, which was itself a kind of discipline, the deliberate emptying of the mind before a task that required full presence. Deaver was larger than Silver Creek by perhaps 1/3, and smaller than Butte by a distance that was not merely geographical. It had the particular character of a county seat that has been a county seat long enough to have developed an institutional solidity, a post office, a courthouse, a land office, a hotel that served meals to non-guests for a modest fee, and the steady traffic of people with business to conduct that required the legitimacy of an official address. The county recorder's office was on the ground floor of the courthouse building, its door marked with a painted board that had been repainted at least twice over the original letters, without quite obscuring the ghost of the earlier versions. Della pushed the door open and went in. The office was smaller than she had imagined. A single room with a counter across its middle and floor-to-ceiling shelving behind the counter on 3 walls. The shelving filled with bound ledgers and document boxes, in a density that suggested every square inch of filing space had been in continuous use for a considerable period. The room smelled of paper and lamp oil, and the particular dry warmth of a space where a stove is kept consistently fed, because the occupant has decided that adequate heat is not a luxury but a professional necessity. The man behind the counter was perhaps 60 years old, lean and precise in his movements, wearing spectacles with round lenses that caught the lamplight when he looked up from the ledger he was writing in. He had the face of someone who has spent his career being the person who knows where everything is and takes that responsibility seriously, not with self-importance, but with the steady, quiet pride of a person who understands that systems work because someone decides to maintain them. He said, "Good morning." Then he looked at her more carefully, the way people look at someone they recognize without yet placing, and said, "You'd be the Crane girl." She said she was. She said she was Della Crane, Gideon Crane's granddaughter, and the recorded heir to the Black Fur Valley property. He set down his pen. He said, "I was wondering when you'd come." The way he said it was not theatrical. It was not the line of a man who had been waiting to deliver it. It was the plain statement of someone who had been keeping a thing in order against the day it would be needed, and had reached that day without particular surprise because he had expected it to arrive eventually, and had simply continued doing his work in the meantime. She put the tin box on the counter and opened it, and laid the 3 documents out in front of him, each one flat, each one in the order she had determined was the most logical sequence for presenting them. The water rights registration first, the letter to Webb second, the private note last. He looked at the documents without touching them at first, the way archivists look at things with his eyes rather than his hands, reading the surfaces and the condition and the provenance of the objects before engaging with their content. Then he picked up the letter carefully by the edges and read it. Then he set it down and looked at her over his spectacles. He said, "I remember this letter. I remember him bringing it in himself. He came on a Thursday morning early before the office was properly open. He knocked on the door, and when I answered, he handed me the envelope and said he wanted it filed and dated, and that he wanted to know that it was in the record. He said that in a way that told me he meant the record permanently not filed and forgotten, but filed and findable. I told him I understood. He thanked me and left." She said, "Did he say anything else?" Webb looked at the letter again. He said, He said that if anyone came to this office with a document purporting to show that he had agreed to sell his property, I should know that it was not what it appeared to be. He said it plainly without accusation, the way a man says something he has already thought through completely and simply needs to make clear. I told him I appreciated the information. He nodded and left. Della said, "Someone came to the property yesterday. His name is Silas Vane. He brought a document dated June 1882, signed with my grandfather's name, claiming to be a preliminary sales agreement for the Black Fir Valley property. The signature is not my grandfather's." Webb was quiet for a moment. He opened the large ledger on the counter and turned to a section near the back, running his finger down a column of indexed entries until he found what he was looking for. He read whatever was there and closed the ledger. He said, "Vane Land and Survey. We've had inquiries from them before. 3 other properties in this county in the last 2 years. He looked at her. Both times the landowners produced documentation, they produced it here. Both times the filing record showed what the record showed. She said, and in those cases, he said, in those cases the landowners did not have prior filings of their own. They had verbal denials and family testimony, which is worth what it's worth in a court proceeding. He paused. You have a formal filing, dated, stamped, entered in the permanent record, which predates any alleged agreement by 3 months, and specifically addresses this circumstance. He took the letter from the counter and carried it to the shelving behind him, and found the bound volume for 1882, and opened it and turned the pages until he found the original, which was there exactly as she had hoped. The same text, the same handwriting, the same county stamp preserved in the permanent record of Deaver County, as Gideon had asked it to be preserved. He came back to the counter and set the copy beside her original. They matched exactly as she had known they would, as Gideon had known they would. Webb took a clean sheet of paper from the drawer beneath the counter and began to write. He wrote for several minutes without speaking his pen, moving in the careful, unrushed way of a man who understands that what he is writing will be read by people who may not be present for the explanation of it, and who therefore takes care to make the document explain itself. When he finished, he signed it, dated it, and pressed the county stamp into the bottom of the page. He slid it across the counter to her. He said, "That is a certified statement from this office confirming the existence and filing date of Gideon Crane's September 1882 letter confirming the filing date and status of the water rights registration of October 1879, and stating that no sales agreement, preliminary or otherwise, conveying the Black Fir Valley property or the water rights attached to it was filed with this office at any time." He looked at her. If Mr. Vane proceeds to the district court with his document, this statement and the original filings will be submitted as contradicting evidence. Any competent judge will see what the record shows. She picked up the statement and read it carefully. Then she folded it once and put it in the tin box with the other documents. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Webb." He said, "Your grandfather was a careful man. He set up a careful situation, and he trusted that someone would be careful enough to follow it through." He looked at her over his spectacles one more time. It appears he was right about that. She left the courthouse and stood on the board sidewalk outside for a moment in the thin midday light. The street was ordinarily busy wagons and horses and the foot traffic of a county seat on a weekday morning, people with business to conduct errands, to run the ordinary machinery of a town, engaged in the act of being a town. She watched it for a moment and felt the particular specific satisfaction of a problem that has been solved with the right tool applied at the right time. Not luck, not rescue, but the execution of a plan that someone had been laying down for 40 years. She bought a meal at the hotel and caught the afternoon hire wagon back to the valley. Thursday came in cold and clear, the sky, the deep winter blue of high altitude and low humidity. The kind of sky that looks like weather has decided to take the day off. Cecil Harmon arrived at the farm at 8 in the morning with May in the wagon beside him and 2 sawhorses in the back, and a coil of rope and a canvas tool roll that he set on the ground outside the barn, and opened with the systematic efficiency of a man who has arrived prepared to work. May jumped down from the wagon before it had fully stopped and landed in the frozen mud, and looked around the yard with the comprehensive assessment of a 12-year-old who has been thinking about this place since a stranger confirmed something was underground here and who has not stopped thinking about it since. She looked at the well. She looked at the barn. She looked at the yard and the collapsed outbuilding and the fir trees on the eastern slope. Then she looked at Della and said, "What do we do first?" Harmon said, "May." May said, "I'm asking what the work is." Della said, "The barn roof. South face upper section. 2 sprung planks and a compromised corner." She pointed. Then she told May that if she wanted to help with the height work, she needed to be able to hold a board steady at arm's length for as long as it took to drive 3 nails, which was perhaps a count of 30 if you were working with a good hammer and knew your angles. May said, "I can do that." Harmon looked at Della with a brief expression that contained several things at once: amusement and recognition, and a kind of parental resigned satisfaction. And then he picked up the near end of the first sawhorse, and they went to work. They had looked at the damage together for about 10 minutes. First, Della explaining what she had assessed from below, and Harmon adding what he could see from the angle of the yard, and the 2 of them arriving at a plan, the way competent people arrive at plans, not by one person directing and the other following, but by each contributing what they could see that the other could not. The collaboration producing a result better than either would have reached alone. The block and tackle from the supply shelf gave them the ability to rig a working platform, using the sawhorses and a pine plank from the wood stack raised to the necessary height and held level. The nails in the supply shelf's labeled jars were exactly the right sizes, which was not a coincidence. The replacement boards were in the stack against the east wall under the canvas that had weathered but held, which was also not a coincidence. May held the boards. She was small for 12, but she was strong, and she had a quality of stillness when she was concentrating that made her exceptionally useful for the kind of work that required sustained precision from the person doing the holding. She did not drift. She did not anticipate. She held the board exactly where she had been asked to hold it, and maintained that position until she was told it was done, at which point she set it down. and looked at the result with the critical eye of someone who intended to do this again and wanted to understand whether what they had done was right. The first plank went up in 40 minutes, the second in 30 because by then everyone understood the system well enough to be efficient within it. The corner repair was the longer work, requiring the careful removal of the compromised boards and the assessment of what was soft and what was merely wet and what was structurally sound enough to nail to a judgment Della made with her hands, and Harmon confirmed with his, and May observed with the complete attention of someone who is learning a thing and knows it. By early afternoon, the corner was repaired and the two upper planks were re-nailed to the fascia, and the barn roof was, if not new, something that intended to stand through another Montana winter without further apology. They came down from the platform, and Della looked up at the south face of the barn from the yard. The new boards sat clean and pale against the gray of the old ones, the contrast stark in the low winter light. The kind of contrast that was honest rather than beautiful, that showed the repair clearly, rather than hiding it the way good repairs often looked before the weather had a chance to even them out. She made tea on the iron hearth in the refuge, carrying the kettle up the stairs and using the sawhorses as a table in the barn, and they sat on overturned nail buckets in the thin amber light of the afternoon and drank it in the particular companionable quiet of people who have done a full day's work together and do not need to fill the quiet to justify the company. Harmon sat with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly the way he had the first day she met him, and was quiet for a while. Then he said that he and Gideon had been neighbors for going on 25 years. He said he had never fully understood the man. He looked at the barn walls around him, the solid old-growth timber. The iron hooks evenly spaced the sound floor. He said I understood he was careful. I understood he was building something, though I never knew what. I always thought it was just the farm, just the usual accumulation of a man working his land. He looked at Della. He said I understand it now. He was building for after, not for himself, for after. Della said yes. That's exactly what he was doing. Harmon was quiet again for a moment. Then he said he asked me about 3 years ago to look after the property if something happened to him, to meet whoever came to claim it, and to help them if they needed help. He said there would be someone. He didn't say who. He said, trust that they'll have the sense to ask for what they need. He looked at her. He was right about that too. May had been sitting on her nail bucket with her cup in her hands and her eyes moving around the barn with the frank, comprehensive interest of a person who is filing information for later use. She had not said much since they came down from the roof. Now she said, without looking at anyone in particular, there's something under the yard, and you went to Deaver yesterday and the man in the good coat isn't gonna get the farm. Harmon said May. May said, I'm not asking. I'm just saying what happened. Della looked at the girl. She said, that's correct. That's exactly what happened. May considered this with the satisfied expression of someone whose accounting has come out right. She drank her tea. After they had gone, the wagon rattling back up the track toward the road. In the last of the afternoon light, Della stood alone in the barn and let the day settle into its proper shape around her. The cold came in through the remaining gaps in the boards as the temperature dropped toward evening, but it was a different cold than it had been before the roof work, less insistent, less certain of its welcome. The new boards were up. The corner would hold. The barn was not finished, was not what it could eventually become. But it was sound, and soundness was the thing that everything else depended on. She went inside and made herself useful. There were things she had been putting off in the way you put off the organizational work when the structural work is more urgent. And now the structural work was done enough to allow the other. She organized the supply shelves by use frequency. The thing she would need daily closest to hand, the thing she would need seasonally. Further back, the thing she would need only once or twice stored in the highest tier, where they waited without inconvenience. She inventoried the food stores again this time, noting not just what was there, but what would need to be supplemented before the first harvest. What she could expect to produce herself in the kitchen garden she was planning along the south wall of the barn, and what she would need to buy or trade for. The list of what she would need to buy was shorter than she had expected. The list of what she could produce herself was longer. This was when she thought about it, the practical consequence of 40 winters of a man thinking about what a person needed to start from nothing and building it into the shelves. He had not left her wealthy. He had left her with enough time to become capable, which was a different thing and in some ways a more valuable one. Silas Vane came on the 7th day. She had not expected him to wait the full 10. Men like Vane, she had decided, did not wait out the clock on a situation they could no longer control. They reassessed. They recalculated. They understood when the ground had shifted under a position they had taken, and they moved, if not gracefully, then efficiently. Because efficiency was the thing they valued. And wasted time was a cost like any other cost. She was in the yard when he arrived, breaking the frozen ground along the south wall of the barn, with a mattock from the tool shelf working in the deliberate way the cold required, finding the angle that let the tool do the work, rather than trying to drive it through frozen earth by force alone. She heard the boots on the track and looked up and saw him coming down from the road in his good coat, his leather document case under his arm, his stride as unhurried as it had been the first time. She set the mattock down and stood up straight and waited. He stopped at the same distance as before, the calibrated distance of a man who understands the geometry of these conversations. He looked at the barn roof, the new boards, the pale wood against the gray. He looked at the yard, at the broken ground along the barn wall, at the lantern light visible in the crack under the barn door, where she had been burning it against the cold. He looked at all of it for a moment with a professional assessment that cost him nothing, and gave her information she did not need. Then he looked at her. She reached into her coat pocket and took out the certified statement from Aldous Webb's office, folded once. She held it toward him. He took it and unfolded it and read it. He read it the way she had read his document, carefully and completely from beginning to end without rushing. She watched his face while he read. His expression did not change significantly, which was, she had decided, the most honest thing about the man. He was not someone who performed surprise or performed defeat, because performing those things required an investment in how others perceived him. That was not consistent with the way he operated. He simply read and processed and reached his conclusion. He refolded the statement and held it back toward her. She took it and put it in her coat pocket. He said, "Your grandfather was more thorough than I anticipated." She said nothing. He said, "The water rights are in the county record." She said, "They have been since 1879. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the barn again, at the roof, at the new work. Then he said, "The property has more potential than it appears." She said, "I know." He looked at her. There was something in his look that was not quite respect, and not quite its absence. A quality of revised assessment. The look of someone who has been wrong about the size of a problem and is acknowledging the revision without dramatizing it. He said, "You'll have no further trouble from my company, Miss Crane." He turned and walked back up the track toward the road. She watched him go, his back straight, his pace, even his coat moving with the cold wind that came down the valley in its long sweeps. He did not look back. She had not expected him to. She stood in the yard for a moment after he was gone and felt the cold against her face and the hard, broken ground under her boots and the particular clean quality of a problem that is finished, not resolved dramatically, not ended with the satisfying crash of something large being destroyed, but simply closed the way a well-fitted door closes firmly, and without excess noise, because it was built right, and it sits in a frame that was built right, and the two fit each other the way they were designed to. She picked up the mattock and went back to work. She broke ground along the south wall of the barn for the rest of that afternoon, working until the light was too low to see the quality of what she was doing, and stopping precisely when it was not before. The earth resisted, and then yielded, and then resisted again in the pattern of frozen ground that is being asked to become something other than frozen ground. And she worked with it rather than against it, finding the rhythm of the tool and the soil, and the cold that made the effort sustainable over the hours it required. This was something Gideon had taught her without teaching it. The understanding that you did not fight the materials you worked with, that good work was not the application of maximum force, but the finding of the right force, at the right angle, in the right sequence. That the materials had properties, and those properties were not obstacles, but information, and that a person who worked with the information rather than against it could do in a day what brute force could not accomplish in a week. She thought about him often as she worked, not in the grieving way she had thought about him in the weeks after his death, the sharp, specific grief of a person who has lost the one good thing, but in a different way. Now a way that had the particular warmth of presence rather than the cold of absence. He was in the room below her feet. He was in the almanac on the shelf in the underground cabin. He was in the margin notes and the labeled jars and the sorted nails and the oilcloth seed packets. He was in the balanced weight of the counterweighted slab and in the level courses of the well stonework and in the flush-set iron hinges that a person would not see unless they were looking carefully. He was in her hands when she held the mattock at the right angle. He was in her eyes when she read the quality of the soil she was turning. He was in the specific, quiet patience she found available to her here, in a way it had not been available in the laundry. The patience of a person who is working at something that is genuinely theirs, something that will bear the marks of their effort in ways that compound over time. She had given notice to Mrs. Bodine. The jar was empty. Silver Creek was behind her, in the way that things go behind you when you have stopped facing them. Not with hostility, not with dramatic declaration, but simply by turning towards something else and walking in that direction until the distance grew to the point where, looking back, required effort you were no longer investing. She did not think about Silver Creek. She thought about rye. The almanac said plant rye along the creek bank. Gideon's margin note said mid-May, not the almanac's date because this valley ran 2 weeks later than the general guidance and he had learned that the hard way and written it down so she would not have to. Mid-May was still months away. But the ground along the creek bank needed to be prepared before planting, needed to be broken and turned and allowed to settle through the last of the winter frosts. And that work began now in February in the cold, with a mattock and patience and the knowledge that the work done today was the reason the work in May would be possible. She was not in a hurry. That was new. The absence of hurry was something she noticed when she put the mattock down at the end of the day and stood for a moment in the yard and recognized it by its absence. The way you recognize the end of a sound that has been continuous long enough that you stopped hearing it. She had been in a hurry for 4 years in Silver Creek. The specific hurry of someone who is falling behind in an arithmetic that does not improve, no matter how fast they move. The hurry had been so constant that she had stopped experiencing it as hurry and had started experiencing it as simply the quality of life, the normal speed at which everything needed to happen if she was going to stay upright. She was not falling behind anymore. The arithmetic had changed. It would change further as the months went on and the kitchen garden came in and the rye was planted and the water rights were developed. And the relationship with Cecil Harmon and May formalized into the neighborly exchange of work and knowledge and resources that Gideon had apparently foreseen as the practical foundation for what she was building here. She descended the stairs for the last time that day and lit the lantern and made her supper and sat at the small table with the almanac and the planting notes and the inventory list and did the quiet, specific work of planning a season. April was the right time to break the lower acre along the creek. The almanac gave guidance on the technique for clay loam, the kind of breaking that prepared it for grain rather than just turning it. May for the rye first along the creek bank where the drainage was best. The kitchen garden along the south wall of the barn once the frost was fully out of the ground, which Gideon's notes said to expect no earlier than mid-May, and to verify by pressing her hand into the soil at 6 inches depth and feeling whether the cold was still in it. Do not be impatient, the margin note said. She was not impatient. She had somewhere in the last week ceased to be impatient in a way that felt permanent rather than situational. a structural change rather than a temporary improvement in circumstances. The farm was still bare and cold and in the early stages of everything. The kitchen garden was a plan, not a garden. The creek bank was frozen ground, not planted rye. The barn needed more work than she had yet addressed. The 40 acres had a long way to go before they would produce what they were capable of producing. None of that was failure. All of it was simply the actual size of the thing she had been given. And the actual size was fine, because she was 19 years old, and she had time, and she had the room below her feet, and she had the spring, and she had the water rights, and she had the almanac and the seeds, and the tools. And she had the specific knowledge her grandfather had given her over 2 summers and a decade of careful letters. The knowledge of a person who had worked this land for 40 years and had written down what he learned and left it where she would find it. May came on her own on a Saturday morning in early March, arriving at the farm without her father, who had apparently approved the visit in advance and sent her with a note that said simply, "She wanted to come. I expect she'll be useful if you'll have her." She was. She had the quality of useful people of being willing to do the work that was actually in front of her, rather than the work that sounded more interesting, and the work in front of her that morning was the continuation of the kitchen garden groundbreaking, which was unglamorous and cold and physically demanding, and which May approached with the same focused stillness she had brought to the barn roof work. They worked for 3 hours in companionable near silence, broken occasionally by May asking precise practical questions about what they were doing and why, and Della answering them with the same precision, because May's questions deserved precise answers, and because explaining the work to someone else clarified it in ways that working alone did not. At mid-morning they stopped, and Della brought the kettle up from the refuge and made tea, and they sat on the stone surround of the well in the cold sunshine and drank it. May looked at the well with the particular expression she wore when she was thinking about something she had not yet decided whether to say. Then she said, "My father says Mr. Vane won't be back." Della said, "No, he won't. May turned her cup in her hands. She said, "My father also says that Gideon Crane built something here that most people couldn't see." Della said, "He did." May looked at the well. She said, "Can I see it now?" She said it simply without drama, a question rather than a request, the question of someone who wants information rather than someone who wants an experience. Della said, "Yes." She lifted the counterweighted slab, and May looked down at the passage and the steps without expression for a moment. Then she said, "He cut each step the same height." She said it the way you note the quality of a thing, not to be impressed, but to understand it. Della said, "He did." He measured. May said, "How long did it take him?" Della said, 40 winters. One thing at a time. May thought about this for a moment. Then she went down the steps with the natural ease of a child who does not yet have the adult habit of hesitating at thresholds, and Della followed her with the lantern. May stood in the room for a full minute without speaking, which was Della had decided the only appropriate response to the room and which said something good about May's quality of attention. She looked at the shelves. She looked at the hearth. She looked at the spring channel and bent and put her fingers in the water and felt the temperature of it, which was constant and slightly warmer than she had expected. She said, "He knew about the spring for 40 years. Della said, "Yes." May said, "And he didn't tell anyone." Della said, "No." May straightened and looked at the cabin in the corner, the quilted curtain in its window, the iron latch on the door. She said, "Why not?" Della thought about how to answer that in a way that was true, and that a 12-year-old would understand. And then she thought that May probably did not need it simplified. And she said, "Because some things need to be protected until the person they're meant for is ready for them." He was waiting for the right person. May looked at her. She said, "You." Della said, "Me." May looked around the room one more time at the ordered shelves and the warm floor and the steady light of the lantern and the spring running its unhurried course through the limestone channel. Then she said, "He was right about you." They came back up into the March morning and put the counterweighted slab back in its place and went back to the garden work. And the rest of the morning passed in the good quiet of two people who have understood something together and do not need to say it again. Cecil Harmon came on a Wednesday in late March with a proposition. He stood in the barn, the same barn they had repaired together in February, and laid it out with the directness that was his consistent quality. He had spoken with the Aldrich family and the Fennett family, the two properties east of the valley, whose lower ground depended on the creek drainage that the Black Fir Spring fed. He had explained the water rights situation and the registration and the name on the county record. He had not pressured anyone. He had simply presented the fact of the situation and let the families decide what to think about it. What they thought it turned out was that a formal water-sharing arrangement with payment to the holder of the rights in the form of a seasonal fee was considerably preferable to the alternative, which was to have the rights held by a party they did not know and had not established any relationship with. The alternative being what would have happened if Silas Vane had succeeded in acquiring the property. Harmon said they're prepared to negotiate, both families. The terms are reasonable on their side. Aldrich lost a third of his grain crop last summer to the dry spell. He understands what the water is worth. Fennett is newer to the valley, but he's not slow. Della sat on a nail bucket and held her cup and thought about it. The water rights were not something she had planned to monetize immediately. She had thought about them as a future possibility, something to develop once she had the farm producing enough that she could afford to think beyond the immediate season. But the offer was concrete, and the need was established, and the relationship with the neighboring families was exactly the kind of relationship that her grandfather had apparently intended her to build. Here, the kind that made a solitary woman on a 40-acre farm in a Montana valley something other than solitary. She said, "I'll meet with them." Harmon said, "I thought you would." She met with Joseph Aldrich the following week, and Thomas Fennett the week after that. Both meetings conducted at kitchen tables with the particular plain directness of rural negotiations between people who have no time for ornamentation and no interest in it. She did not have a lawyer, and she did not need one. The terms were straightforward, and the documentation she prepared herself, modeled on the language of the county registration, clean and specific, and signed by all parties, and witnessed by Cecil Harmon, who brought May, who sat in the corner of the Aldrich kitchen and did her sums, while the adults talked and occasionally looked up to observe the negotiation with the evaluative interest of someone who was storing the process for later reference. The first payment came in April. It was not large, but it was consistent, and it was hers earned by the work of a man who had understood 40 years ago that the spring running through his root cellar was not an inconvenience, but an asset, and had protected it accordingly. May came slowly, and then all at once, in the way that springs come to high valleys that have held their cold. Late a transformation that happens not by degree, but by a single morning when the air smells different, and the ground underfoot gives differently, and something in the light changes quality in a way that is not describable in terms of brightness or angle, but only in terms of intention. The season finally committing to what it had been building toward all the weeks before. Della woke that morning before light, as she had woken most mornings since coming to the farm, in the warm dark of the underground room with the spring running its commentary and the quilt that smelled of cedar and lavender. She lay still for a moment and felt the quality of the air coming down the stairs from above, the way it was different from the air that had come down for the past 3 months, lighter, carrying something that had not been in it the day before. She dressed and went up. The valley was still in the gray before dawn, the fir trees holding their dark shapes, the creek catching the first light at its surface. The frost was gone from the yard. The ground where she had broken the garden along the south wall of the barn showed the dark color of earth that was ready. The brown-black that Gideon had shown her was the color of soil that held what it was given. She went to the barn and brought out the seed satchel, the rye first, along the creek bank where the drainage was best, where the clay loam soil was richest and the moisture most consistent. She walked the bank with the seed pouch open against her palm, the way the almanac described casting in the particular rhythm that put the seed at the right density, not so thick that it would compete with itself, not so sparse that the ground was wasted. The creek ran its clear sound beside her feet. The sun came up behind the eastern ridge and laid its light along the valley floor in a long horizontal sweep that made everything it touched look solid and permanent and real. She cast seed and walked and cast seed and walked, and did not hurry because hurrying was not the work. The work was the even hand and the right density and the patience to do it the same way from the first row to the last, which was the same patience the room below her feet had required, the same patience every worth-building thing required from the person building it. May arrived mid-morning with a trowel and a purpose ready for the kitchen garden along the barn wall. She had brought onion sets from her father's surplus and a packet of her own saved lettuce seed that she held out to Della with the gravity of someone offering something they have valued. Della took it and said, "Thank you," and meant it. They planted the south garden together through the morning, May working the trowel, and Della following with the seed packets, each one opened carefully and used at the rate that the cards above the supply shelf advised. The turned ground received the seed the way good ground receives things, without resistance, as though it had been waiting. Harmon came in the afternoon with a flat of seedling plants he had started in his own cold-frame tomatoes and squash for the garden's warm section, and the three of them worked until the light began to go. And when they stopped, the south garden was planted end to end, and the soil was dark and even, and the barn wall above it held the last warmth of the day, the way south-facing walls do, radiating back what they had absorbed, giving it to the ground below. They sat on the stone surround of the well afterward, the three of them in the last of the May afternoon, and did not say much because much did not need to be said. The farm was not finished. It would not be finished for a long time. Perhaps not ever, in the way that a thing finished means you no longer need to work on it. Because farms were not that kind of thing. They were the kind of thing that asked for your continued presence and rewarded it accordingly. But the rye was in. The garden was planted. The water rights were documented, and the agreements were signed, and the payments were coming. The barn roof was sound. The supply shelves were stocked. The spring ran in its channel below the yard, clear and constant, as it had run for longer than anyone had been alive to notice it. Harmon looked at the work they had done that afternoon with the expression of a man who has witnessed the beginning of something and recognizes it as such. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said quietly, not to anyone in particular, "Your grandfather would have liked her." May, sitting beside him with her knees pulled up and her cup balanced on them, looked at Della and said nothing. But she smiled the particular smile of a person who has held an opinion for some time and has just seen it confirmed. Della heard the words and let them settle into the day, the way the May warmth settled into the south wall of the barn. Not dramatically, not with the sharp quality of a thing that startles, but with the steady radiating quality of a warmth that had been stored up over time and was now being given back. She stayed at the well after Harmon and May had gone, sitting on the stone surround in the last of the light. The valley was going quiet around her, in the way it went quiet each evening, the sounds of the day settling into the smaller sounds of dusk. The creek, the wind in the firs somewhere to the east, a bird finishing its last statement of the afternoon. She looked down into the well. She could see the rope, still the same rope, her grandfather's last rope, pale hemp, in the dark of the shaft. She could feel the warm air rising from below, the faint mineral freshness of the spring that had been running down there through 40 winters of a man working alone in the dark. 40 winters of stones laid level and boards planed smooth and seeds packed in oilcloth and notes written in the margins of an almanac that would not be read until the man was gone. She thought about the 2 joined circles he had cut into the stone at the second course of the well wall, worn smooth but legible, the mark he used to seal his letters. She thought about how long he had known she would come here. Not hoped. Known with the specific confidence of a man who has taken the measure of a person and found them adequate to the task, who has built accordingly and trusted the result. He had been right about her. She had come to the farm with a coin jar and a canvas bag, and a letter she had read 4 times on the edge of a narrow cot in a room above a laundry. She had come not because she was certain of what she would find, but because her grandfather had told her to look, and she had been taught by him that looking carefully was itself the work, that most of what the world contained was available to a person who was willing to look at things as they actually were, rather than as they appeared to be, or as other people described them. She had looked. She had found what he left her. She had held it against the first attempt to take it away. She had planted the first season's seed in ground that was ready for it. She was 19 years old, and she was sitting on the stone surround of a well in a valley most people had written off and below her feet. A spring ran through a room her grandfather had built for her over 40 winters, and beside her to the south, the kitchen garden was planted. And along the creek bank, the rye was in, and the sky above the valley wall was going from blue to the first pale suggestion of the stars that would be there fully in an hour. Della Crane was not asking the world for a place. She was sitting in one.